The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Elara Ashcroft had decided would be her last morning of peace. She had been sitting at the small window of her bedroom, watching the gardener trim the hedges that no one had bothered to trim since her mother died, and she had been thinking about nothing in particular, which was the closest thing to happiness she had felt in months. Then her father's voice came through the door, not knocking, never knocking, and the peace was over. He did not sit down when he came in. He stood in the center of the room with his hands behind his back, the way he stood when he was about to say something that he had already decided and did not wish to discuss. Elara turned from the window and looked at him. She had learned, very early in her life, to read the exact degree of trouble by the angle of his shoulders. This morning the angle was bad. "You are to be married," he said. "To Duke Caelian Voss of Morthaven." She heard the words. She arranged them in order. She waited to feel something, and when nothing came she said, "When?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She looked back at the window. The gardener was still trimming. A bird landed on the top of the hedge and was immediately frightened off by the sound of the shears. Elara thought, for a moment, that she understood exactly how that bird felt. "He is in a wheelchair," her father said, as though this were a detail she might need clarified, like the color of the curtains in the house she was being sent to. "There was an injury. Years ago. He manages the duchy from his chair. The estate is in good order. The finances are sound." He paused. "Ours are not." There it was. The whole shape of it, laid out in 3 sentences. Elara was 22 years old, the third daughter of an earl who had spent the last decade gambling away what 4 generations had built, and she was being sold. Not in those words. Never in those words. But in every real and practical sense, she was being handed to a man she had never met in exchange for the cancellation of her father's considerable debts. "Does he know anything about me?" she asked. Her father's expression shifted very slightly, in the way of a man who finds a question inconvenient. "He requested someone quiet," he said. "Sensible. Someone who would not cause trouble." So she had been recommended based on her most useful quality, which was that she had never, in 22 years, been considered remarkable enough to cause trouble. She was the daughter who read books instead of dancing at parties. The daughter who remembered everyone's appointments and reminded them quietly. The daughter who would do what was needed and not make a scene about it. "All right," she said. Her father blinked. He had, apparently, prepared himself for an argument. "All right," he repeated. "All right," she said again, and turned back to the window. He left without saying anything else. She sat in the silence he left behind and looked at the hedge and thought about the fact that in 3 weeks she would be Lady Voss of Morthaven, wife to a duke she had never spoken to, in a house she had never seen, in a life she had not chosen. Then she opened the drawer of her writing desk, took out a small notebook, and began making a list of what she would need to pack. She was the wrong daughter at the wrong time, and she had always known it. The difference was that now it had been made official. The wedding was on a gray morning in early October. The church was cold and nearly empty. Her father sat in the front pew with the expression of a man who has settled an unpleasant debt. Her 2 sisters had not come. One was ill, the other had sent a note that said, simply, "Congratulations," with no punctuation and no other words, which told Elara everything she needed to know about how her family regarded this arrangement. She walked down the aisle alone, because her father had chosen to remain seated, which was not traditional but which she had been half expecting. The stone floor echoed under her shoes. She counted the echoes because it gave her something to do with her mind. Duke Caelian Voss was waiting at the altar. She had been told he was 30, that he was tall when he stood, and that the wheelchair was the result of a riding accident 5 years ago that had damaged his spine. She had been told his hair was dark and his estate was well managed and his temperament was considered steady by those who worked for him. What she had not been told was how he would look at her when she reached the altar. He looked at her the way someone looks at a door that they have been waiting a long time to open. Not with hunger and not with assessment. With a kind of quiet recognition, as though he had been expecting someone and was relieved that she had finally arrived. Elara did not know what to do with that look. So she looked at the minister instead. The ceremony was short. The vows were traditional. When the minister said the part about taking each other, Elara said the words clearly and in the correct order, because she had rehearsed them, and because it was not in her nature to stumble over words she already knew. Caelian said his vows in a voice that was low and very calm, and when it was done he looked at her again with that same expression and she looked away again. They signed the register. A servant witnessed it. The minister shook their hands. Outside, the carriage was waiting. Elara sat in it across from her new husband and looked at the road as it passed the window. Caelian said nothing for the first several minutes. The countryside moved past, brown and cold and already tipping into winter. Then he said, "Are you warm enough?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and looked at the road on his side of the carriage. They did not speak again for the rest of the journey, which was an hour and a half, which was long enough for Elara to understand that she was not going to be pressed or interrogated or expected to perform. That was something, at least. That was not nothing. Morthaven Hall appeared through the trees as the carriage came around a wide bend in the road, and Elara's first thought was that it was very large, and her second thought was that it would take a long time to learn the shape of it, and her third thought was that she had exactly one trunk in the carriage behind her and that a woman with one trunk is a woman who has already decided not to take up too much space. The carriage stopped. A butler appeared. 2 footmen helped with the trunk. Caelian's chair was brought around and he moved into it with the ease of someone who has long since made peace with the mechanics of his own life. He looked up at her from the chair. That look again. That door-waiting look. "Welcome to Morthaven," he said. She looked up at the front of the house, at the dark stone and the many windows and the ivy that had been carefully trimmed back from the frames. She looked at it and she thought that welcome was a large word for such a cold morning, and that she would reserve judgment on whether it applied. "Thank you," she said anyway, because she had manners, and because she had learned that gratitude cost nothing. They went inside. The hall was enormous. Her footsteps were very small in it. That night, she sat at the large dining table in the room at the end of the long corridor, and a meal was brought to her, and she ate it while reading a book she had taken from the shelf in the hallway. And Caelian sat at the other end of the table and ate his meal and did not look at his own book, which was open beside his plate. He was reading her instead. She knew it. She did not acknowledge it. She turned her pages and ate her soup and decided that if this was the shape of her life now, it was survivable. She had survived worse. She had survived being invisible in the house where she was born. She could survive being visible in the house where she had been delivered. The bed in her room was large and cold and she lay in the center of it and stared at the ceiling for a long time before she slept. The house made sounds around her. Old houses always do. Creaking wood. Wind in the chimney flues. The distant settling of stone. And, just before she finally closed her eyes, from somewhere in the east corridor, the sound of footsteps. Slow and measured and careful footsteps. On a floor that no wheelchair could cross that quietly. She listened for a long moment. Then she told herself it was the house settling and turned onto her side and closed her eyes. It was the first lie she told herself at Morthaven. It would not be the last. The library at Morthaven Hall was the only warm room in the house. Elara found it on her 3rd day. Not because anyone showed her but because she had been systematically opening every door she passed in the East Wing, cataloging her new home the way she had always catalogued unfamiliar things. With quiet attention and no announcements. The first door was a linen cupboard. The second was a small sitting room that smelled of old tobacco. The third was the library, and when she opened it the warmth came out like a breath. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the shelves. They went from floor to ceiling on 3 walls. There was a fireplace with a good fire already in it, which meant someone maintained this room, which meant someone used it. She walked in and looked at the spines of the books and ran one finger along a row and stopped at a title she recognized. She pulled it out. It was a history of the northern provinces, dry and dense, and exactly the kind of book she enjoyed because the density of it meant she could disappear into it completely and not come up for air for hours. She opened it to the first page. There was writing in the margin. Small and precise, in dark ink. Not underlining, not decoration. Actual notes. Arguments. The kind of annotations that someone writes when they are reading actively and have strong opinions about what they are reading. She read the note. It disagreed with the author's conclusion in the opening paragraph and offered 3 alternative interpretations in about 40 words, which was efficient and pointed and, she had to admit, correct. She sat down in the chair nearest the fire, because it was warm and she was cold and the chair was good, and she read the book and the margin notes together, and the experience was strange and interesting, like reading a conversation between 2 people where you could only hear one of them. She did not know it was Caelian's handwriting yet. But she suspected. She read for 2 hours, and when she finally closed the book she sat for a moment and looked at the fire and thought about the margin notes and thought about the man at the end of the dinner table who had looked at her like she was a door and had not once tried to open her. The next morning she came back. She chose a different book. Different topic. The margin notes in this one were even more interesting, denser, occasionally frustrated in tone. There was one note, next to a particularly sweeping claim about the nature of governance, that said simply, "This is the kind of thinking that costs people their homes." She took out a pencil from her coat pocket, because she always carried one, and she wrote underneath it, "And yet he makes this argument in 4 different chapters and calls it evidence." She shelved the book and left. She did not go back to that particular book for 3 days. When she did, there was new writing under hers, in the same precise dark ink. It said, "You are right. I had not counted." She looked at those 4 words for a long time. Then she turned to the next page, where the author made another claim, and she wrote her response in the margin, and she left the book on the table instead of shelving it. It was, she thought, the first real conversation she had had since arriving at Morthaven. The fact that neither of them had spoken it out loud seemed, somehow, exactly right. They still barely talked at dinner. Occasionally one of them would make a remark about the meal, or about the weather, which had turned sharply cold with a promise of snow that had not yet delivered. Caelian asked her once if the room she had been given was comfortable and she said yes, which was true. He asked her once if there was anything she needed and she said she could not think of anything at present, which was also true. She watched him, in the careful and undetectable way she had learned as a child in a household where watching was safer than asking. He was precise in his movements. He wasted nothing. When the servants spoke to him he listened to them with full attention, not the half attention of a man who has decided he already knows what is important. A dairy farmer came to the door one afternoon with a dispute about the boundary of his land and the land of his neighbor, and Elara watched from the staircase as Caelian received him in the entrance hall and listened to the full account of the dispute, which took 23 minutes, and then spoke for about 4 minutes and resolved it. The farmer left looking surprised and satisfied, which Elara knew from experience was the hardest combination to achieve. She went back to the library. She found a book on land boundary law and read it. She left a note in the margin on page 41, where the book described the exact kind of dispute she had witnessed. The note said, "I saw you handle this today. The book says you were technically incorrect but practically correct. I think the book is missing something." When she came back the next day, the response was there. It said, the book was written by someone who had never stood in a field and tried to explain to 2 men why the fence is in the wrong place. Theory and practice are different languages. She smiled. She did not know she was smiling until she felt it and then she stopped, not because it was wrong but because it was unexpected. She had not smiled privately over a book since she was a girl and had no reason yet to stop. She wrote, then perhaps someone should write a better book. She left it on the table. Weeks passed. The snow came and it was serious snow, the kind that filled the lower windows and silenced the countryside and made Morthaven Hall feel like the only remaining place in the world. Elara was not unhappy, which surprised her. She had expected to be unhappy. She had packed herself for unhappiness the way you pack an umbrella even when the forecast is uncertain. Instead, she was something harder to name. Alert, maybe. Interested. There was always a new book with notes she had not read yet. There was the estate itself, which was well run in ways that she increasingly understood were not accidental. The farmers were treated fairly. The servants were paid well and on time. The tenants in the village had their complaints addressed without delay. She asked the housekeeper, a practical woman named Mrs. Clare, how long the Duke had managed the estate this way. Since he came back from the accident, my lady, Mrs. Clare said. Changed him, it did. Not in a sad way. In a sharp way. Elara thought about that. She thought about a man who had been broken and had used the time it took to heal to think very clearly about what mattered. She recognized that. She had done something similar, on a smaller scale, in the years of being overlooked in her father's house. Invisibility is an education, if you decide to use it as one. One evening she came to dinner a few minutes early and found Caelian already at the table, reading. He did not notice her immediately. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him read, and she saw his face in its unguarded state, which was different from his face at dinner. Quieter. More open. There was something in it that she could not fully name, something that looked, she thought, like a man who was patient in the specific way of a man who has been waiting a very long time. He looked up and saw her. For 1 second his face stayed unguarded. Then it settled back into its usual calm. Good evening, he said. Good evening, she said, and came to the table and sat down. The meal arrived. They ate in their usual quiet. But something had shifted, very slightly, like a door that has not opened but is no longer quite shut. She found the servant's comment by accident. She had been in the East Hall looking for a particular book that Mrs. Clare had mentioned was in a second, smaller library at the back of the house, and she had taken a wrong turn and come out into a passage she did not know, and she had heard 2 of the younger maids talking on the other side of a door that she had not yet opened. The old physician was sent away before we arrived, one of them said. Bridget told me. He was writing reports that said one thing and the Duke was another thing entirely. What do you mean, another thing entirely? She said she saw him in the East Corridor once, walking, when he didn't know she was there. Holding the wall, mind you, but walking. A pause. Fabric rustling. Some injuries are strange like that, the other maid said. My uncle had a bad back that came and went. This is not a bad back, the first one said firmly, and then they moved away and the voices faded. Elara stood in the passage for a moment. Then she went back the way she had come, to the main library, and she did not go looking for the second library after all. She sat in the chair by the fire and she held the information in her mind and she turned it over carefully, the way you turn over something that might be sharp, checking its edges before you decide how to carry it. She thought about footsteps in the East Corridor on her first night. She thought about the physician who had been dismissed for writing reports that did not match the truth. She thought about the way Caelian moved in his chair, the precision of it, the economy of it, and also, when she thought carefully, the moments when his movements had been slightly different from what she would expect. A certain set of his shoulders. A particular way of holding himself. She thought about the words, theory and practice are different languages. She did not go to him and ask. It was not her business yet. Perhaps it would never be her business. A man was entitled to his own reasons for the shape his life had taken. She, of all people, understood that. But she filed it. Carefully. In the place where she kept things that mattered. That night, for the first time, she did not hear the footsteps in the east corridor, because she had left her window cracked open and the wind was too loud. Or perhaps she was not listening for them anymore in the same way. She had begun to listen for something else instead, something she could not yet put a name to, which was the sound of her own life beginning to interest her again. The river rose on a Thursday. Elara found out the way she found out most things at Morthaven, not through announcement but through observation. She saw a farmhand arrive at the back gate at 6:30 in the morning, breathless and mud-covered, and she was already dressed because she had never needed much sleep and because the wind had changed in the night and she had been listening to it from her window and wondering what it meant. She went downstairs. Caelian was already in the entrance hall. He had received the farmhand and was now giving instructions to his steward, a compact and efficient man named Mr. Holt, in a voice that was low and calm and completely serious. Elara stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. The river had broken its bank at the southern field. The Dunmore family, tenants for 4 generations, had a farmhouse that sat in a low section of that land. The water was coming in fast. They had 3 children and an elderly mother and they had managed to get to the second floor but the ground floor was already under water and rising. "I am going," Caelian said. Mr. Holt looked at him. The look was careful and respectful and said a number of things without saying any of them. "I am going," Caelian said again, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. Elara said, from the staircase, "I am coming as well." Both men looked at her. She met Caelian's gaze. "I grew up near a river," she said. "I know what a flood looks like. I am coming." There was a pause. Something moved through Caelian's expression that she could not fully read. Then he said, "Get your coat." She was already wearing it. The carriage was fast and the road was bad and by the time they reached the edge of the Dunmore land the water was already over the lower wall and moving through the field in thick brown sheets. Elara had seen flooding before. She had not seen flooding this serious. The farmhouse was visible at the end of the track, its lower windows dark with water, the lantern in the upper window blinking like a small heartbeat. She got out of the carriage before it had fully stopped and the cold hit her like a flat hand. The water was around her boots immediately, shockingly cold, pulling at the ground with a kind of slow insistence that was worse than force. Mr. Holt shouted something behind her. One of the farmhands had brought a length of rope. She waded toward the house. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could hear, behind her, the sounds of Caelian getting out of the carriage, and she chose, in that moment, not to look, because she understood instinctively that he did not want to be watched in whatever he was about to do, and she understood that because she had spent 22 years not wanting to be watched during the moments that cost her something. She reached the front wall of the farmhouse. The door was swollen shut with water. She hit it with her shoulder, once, twice, and then a third time, and it gave, and cold dark water poured past her feet and she was inside. The family was on the stairs. The grandmother first, then the 3 children, the smallest one wrapped in a blanket that was already wet. The mother was behind them, holding a candle in a jar that had somehow stayed lit. "All right," Elara said. "Come to me. One at a time." She took the first child. A boy, perhaps 5, with wide eyes and no expression, the particular blankness of a child who is frightened past the point of crying. She held him against her side and waded back toward the door. When she came out into the open water, Caelian was there. Not in the chair. He was standing at the post that marked the edge of the farmyard, one hand braced against it, the water around his thighs, and he was reaching out his other arm to her. She walked toward him and transferred the child to him without a word and turned back for the next one. She saw him. He knew she saw him. They did not speak. 4 trips. 3 children and the grandmother, who was small and frightened and grabbed Elara's arm with both hands and did not let go until they reached the carriage. The mother came last, refusing to go before her family, which Elara respected too much to argue with. By the time they had all 7 people from the farmhouse into the carriage and the farmhand's wagon, the water was at Elara's waist and the cold had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing, which she knew was the more dangerous state. She turned around and Caelian was beside her, closer than she expected, and for a moment they were both standing in the flood water in the dark and the rain and looking at each other, and it was the closest they had been to each other since the wedding. And it was also the most honest moment they had shared since she had arrived at Morthaven, because there was no table between them and no performance and no distance, just 2 people who had done what needed to be done and were now wet and cold. And exactly where they were. "Come," he said. "Before you freeze." She looked at him. He was standing without the post now. Just standing, in the water, with the rain coming down, and he looked back at her with that look that she had been trying to name since the altar, and she finally had a word for it now, or almost a word. It was the look of a man who had been afraid of something for a long time and had just discovered it was not as frightening as he had expected. She looked at him for one moment more. Then she turned toward the carriage and walked. He did not go back to the chair until they were nearly at the house. She was sitting across from him in the carriage, her coat dripping, her hands wrapped around a flask of hot tea that Mr. Holt had pressed into her hands with the focused urgency of a man who expresses concern through logistics. The Dunmore family were in the wagon ahead. The children had, finally, started crying, which Elara felt was probably healthier than the blankness. She looked at Caelian. He was watching the road. She said nothing. He looked at her. He was, she thought, waiting. Waiting for the question, the exclamation, the demand for an explanation. He had the look of a man braced for something unpleasant. She handed him the flask. "Drink," she said. "You are as cold as I am." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took the flask. They arrived at Morthaven at almost midnight. The household was lit up and waiting, and Mrs. Clare appeared immediately with blankets and sharp instructions for the footmen. The Dunmore family were taken to the servants' quarters where there was room and warmth. Elara was marched upstairs by Mrs. Clare herself and made to change her clothes and sit by the fire in her room and drink something hot and strong that tasted like honey and something else. She sat by the fire and she thought about the river and the child with the white eyes and the mother with the candle in the jar. She thought about Caelian standing in the water with one hand on the post and then both hands free. She thought about the look on his face and the way he had stood and the way the whole shape of what she thought she understood about her life at Morthaven had just shifted under her feet like floodwater over a field. She was not angry. She noticed this. She had expected to be angry when the truth became undeniable, and she was not. She was something more complicated than anger. She was the feeling of a picture coming into focus after being blurry for weeks, where the picture is both more interesting and more unsettling than the blur had been. She sat by the fire until the hot drink cooled in her hands, and then she set it down and went to bed, and this time she did not listen for footsteps because she already knew what they meant. 3 days after the flood, a letter arrived at Morthaven Hall that was not addressed to her, but that changed everything anyway. She did not read it. She did not have to. She had been in the hall when it arrived, had seen the expression on Caelian's face when Mr. Holt brought it to him on a small tray, and she had watched him open it with the particular stillness of a man who already knows what he is about to find. His face went very neutral, in the specific way that faces go neutral when the information inside them is too large for any expression. He took the letter to his study. The door was closed for 2 hours. When he came out, he went directly to Mr. Holt and spoke to him for 20 minutes in a low voice, and then he came to the library. Elara was there, which she suspected he had known she would be. She was sitting in her usual chair with a book and she did not look up immediately when he came in, which gave him the grace of entering the room at his own pace and on his own terms. When she did look up, he was sitting across from her. The fire was between them. He had the letter in his hand, folded and creased from being read more than once. "I have something to explain to you," he said. She closed her book. She looked at him. She waited. He told her about Lord Aldrich Brent. Brent was the man who controlled 3 of the counties that bordered Morthaven to the north and east. He was not a man who wanted neighbors who were equal to him. He was the kind of man who required everyone around him to be smaller, weaker, more desperate, because it was only in contrast to those things that he felt like what he was. Powerful people of that kind, Elara knew, were the most dangerous variety, because their aggression was never quite honest. It was always dressed as something else. 5 years ago, when Caelian's riding accident occurred, Brent had moved. Not physically. He had moved through lawyers and rumor and the kind of pressure that leaves no fingerprints. He had begun to suggest, in the right rooms, to the right people, that the Duke's injury was severe enough to make him incapable of managing his estates, and that perhaps the duchy should pass into a form of receivership until such time as a suitable heir could be identified. Brent was not interested in the duchy. He was interested in the river. The Morthaven river system was the primary water source for 6 farming villages. Whoever controlled the land controlled the water, and whoever controlled the water controlled the people who needed it. It was an old form of power and it was still effective, and Brent had been patient about it. Caelian had known all of this within the first month of his recovery. He had lain in his bed in the east wing, in the room she now understood was the room at the end of the corridor with the light under the door, and he had thought very clearly about his situation. And he had made a decision. If Brent required him to be broken, he would be broken. Publicly. Completely. He would be the crippled Duke, in the chair, managing nothing, and while Brent was looking at the performance, the reality would be something else entirely. He had sent the old physician away because the man had been writing honest reports. He had hired one who was willing to write reports that reflected the performance and not the truth. The accident was real, he said. The injury was real. The recovery was real but incomplete. There are days when standing is not possible. There are days when it is. It is not stable and it is not something that can be predicted, and I have made my peace with that. But I am not what the reports say I am, and I have not been for 3 years. Elara looked at the fire. Brent has been watching, Caelian said. He watches all the time. He has people in the village. I do not know who they all are. What I do know is that the night of the flood, I was seen. Not by Brent himself. But by someone who will report to him. The letter, she said, is from my solicitor in the city. Brent is preparing a legal petition. He is going to argue that the Duke's public management of his estate was misrepresented, that I was not who the official record claimed I was, and that the duchy should therefore be subject to review. Elara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is the petition legally sound?" Caelian looked at her. Partially. What does it need to succeed? Witnesses who will testify to what they saw. And a record that can be challenged. She was quiet again. The fire shifted. A log fell to one side and sent up a small scatter of sparks. You chose me, she said, because I was someone no one would bother watching. He met her gaze. He did not look away. Yes. You needed someone inside this household who could not be weaponized against you by Brent, because no one with any power or any interest in this situation would consider me significant enough to cultivate as an informant. Yes. Because I was the overlooked daughter of a bankrupt earl, with no money and no allies and no connections worth exploiting. Yes, he said. And then, and because you were reported to be quiet and sensible and someone who would not cause trouble. She looked at him. He said, quietly, which turned out to be a description so incomplete as to be nearly useless. She thought about that. She thought about the margin notes and the flood and the child with the wide eyes and the way he had stood in the water with both hands free. She thought about the look on his face at the altar, the door-waiting look, and she thought that she had been right about what it meant and wrong about what it meant, simultaneously, and that both versions were true. She was chosen because she was overlooked. And she had been noticed, specifically and carefully, anyway. Those two things did not cancel each other. They sat side by side, which was more complicated. "What does Brent need to build his case?" she asked. Caelian said, "He needs people who saw me walk. He needs testimony about the physician. He needs a record of the estate being managed in a way inconsistent with the official account of my capabilities. And he needs time. Which is the one thing he does not have," she said, "if we move first." Caelian looked at her. That look again. But different this time. Not the door-waiting look. Something else. Something that was, she thought, the look of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just looked at someone standing next to him and thought, "Perhaps this one will help me carry it." He said. "I have been reading your margin notes for 2 months," she said. "I know how you think. I know how you build an argument. I know the exact degree to which you are willing to be technically incorrect for the sake of being practically correct." She looked at him steadily. "I have also, in that time, been reading about Aldrich Brent, because 3 weeks ago I found a reference to his name in a land record that seemed irregular to me, and I have been following the irregularity." Caelian was very still. "I have notes," she said. "Quite a lot of them." She brought the notes to the library table and they spread them out together, and it was the first time they had been side by side at close range with a purpose, and it was, Elara thought, exactly like the margin notes, except that now the conversation was spoken and the space between them was 12 inches instead of a page. She had been thorough. She had not intended to be collecting evidence. She had intended to understand the estate, because understanding the place she lived in was how she had always made herself useful, and it was the only mode she knew. But in understanding the estate, she had found the irregularities, and the irregularities had a shape, and the shape, once you knew to look for it, had Aldrich Brent's name written all over it. 3 transactions in the land registry that did not match. A pattern of delays in the village water rights renewals that seemed accidental but occurred with too much regularity to be accidental. 2 tenants who had been approached by a man from the city, offering better terms on their leases if they moved their land agreements away from the Mordhaven Duchy. "He has been building toward this for years," she said. "Long before the flood. Long before anyone saw you stand up." Caelian looked at the papers. He looked at them the way he looked at everything, with complete attention. "How did you find this?" he said. "I asked Mrs. Clare about the water rights renewals because one of the tenants mentioned it in passing and the timing seemed odd to me. And then I found the registry irregularities because I was reading about land boundary law because of the dispute you settled in the entrance hall 6 weeks ago." She paused. "And then the rest of it came together because once you start pulling a loose thread, the whole thing eventually comes with it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You have been investigating my estate," he said. "I have been learning my home," she said. "What I found in the process is yours to use as you like." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Elara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed. "Yes," she said. "I owe you an explanation about why you were chosen." "Not the practical one. The other one." She waited. "You were chosen," he said, "because I needed someone the world would not bother watching." "That is true. And I also chose you because of every report I read about you, which I had read carefully, and in every one of them there was a gap. A gap between what was said and what was not said. People described you as quiet and unremarkable and well-behaved, and every description had the feeling of someone describing a room they had never really been in. And I thought that a person about whom everyone is that consistently wrong must be someone very worth knowing." She looked at him. "I was right," he said simply. She did not know what to do with that, so she looked at the papers on the table and said, "Then let us not give Aldrich Brent his petition. Let us give him something else entirely." The meeting was on a Friday. Elara had spent 4 days preparing for it. She had worked at the library table each morning with the systematic attention of someone who has always done their best work when no one was watching, which was everyone who does their best work in private and has learned to be at peace with that. She organized the documents in order of legal weight. The land registry irregularities came first, because those were the foundation. The water rights delays came second, with dates and records attached. The testimony from the 2 tenants who had been approached by Brent's man came third. She had spoken to them herself, quietly, over 2 separate afternoons, explaining what she needed and why, and they had agreed without hesitation, because farmers who depend on a river system understand very clearly who their real friends are. At the bottom of the stack she placed the letter from Brent's own solicitor, which she had been given by Caelian, and which contained, buried in its careful legal language, 2 sentences that contradicted each other in a way that a careful reader would notice and a hasty one would not. She had noticed. She also spent one of the 4 days in the village, which was not something she had done often but which she found, once she did it, entirely natural. She spoke to the shopkeeper and to the woman who managed the post and to an older farmer who had lived in the area his whole life and knew its history as well as he knew his own face. She bought a newspaper. She drank a cup of tea in the small front room of the post house and listened to the conversations around her and learned, in an hour, more about the local feeling toward Aldrich Brent than any document could have told her. The feeling was not friendly. Brent arrived at Mordhaven on Friday morning with 2 solicitors and a clerk and the particular manner of a man who has decided in advance that he has already won. He was not a large man in the physical sense, but he had the presence of someone who has spent a long time in rooms where everyone agrees with him, and this had given him a quality that was not quite confidence and not quite arrogance but something between the two, a heavy, settled certainty that expressed itself in the way he looked around a room when he first entered it, as though assessing its value. He looked around the entrance hall of Mordhaven. He assessed it. Elara watched from the upper landing and thought, calmly, that he was about to have a very different morning than he had planned. They met in the large sitting room on the ground floor, which Elara had chosen because it was formal enough for the purpose and comfortable enough that no one could claim they had been treated with deliberate discomfort. Brent's solicitors sat on one side. Caelian's solicitor, a precise and quiet man named Mr. Alderton who had arrived from the city the previous evening, sat on the other. Caelian was at the head of the table in his chair. Elara sat at his right. Brent looked at her briefly when she sat down. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes filed her as unimportant and moved on, which was exactly what she had expected and exactly what she needed. He began. He was articulate and organized and his presentation was professionally done. He laid out the argument about the duchy's management, the questions about the official records, the petition for review. He did not raise his voice. He was pleasant about it, which was, Elara thought, the most openly threatening kind of pleasant she had encountered. He finished. He looked at Caelian. Caelian said, "Thank you. My wife has a response." Brent looked at Elara. She looked at him with the same expression she had used her whole life in rooms where people did not expect her to be interesting, which was no expression at all. She placed the first document on the table and pushed it toward Brent's solicitor. "This is a land registry record from 4 years ago," she said. "The second entry on page 3 is marked as a routine renewal. It is not a routine renewal. The parcel described was transferred to a holding company in which Lord Brent is a silent partner. The transfer was documented in a way designed to resemble a renewal to casual review but which, on close examination, represents an acquisition of land that bordered the eastern water tributary." She paused. "The acquisition was not declared, as it is legally required to be, to the Duchy office." Brent's expression had not changed. His solicitor had, however, leaned slightly forward. She placed the second document. "This is a record of the water rights renewals for the village tenants over the past 3 years. The delays in renewal, which created periods of legal uncertainty during which the tenants were technically unprotected, follow a pattern that correlates precisely with dates on which Brent's company was actively negotiating with those tenants' neighboring landholders." She placed the third. These are signed statements from 2 tenants who were approached by a representative of Lord Brent's company in the autumn of last year. The representative offered them improved lease terms in exchange for transferring their land agreements away from the Morthaven Duchy. The tenants declined. They have agreed to testify if required. Silence. And this, she said, placing the letter, is Lord Brent's solicitor's own correspondence, in which the basis for the petition is outlined. I would direct your attention to the 3rd paragraph on page 2 and the 1st paragraph on page 4, which describe the same event in terms that are legally incompatible with each other. If both statements are true, the petition cannot stand. If only one is true, it must be specified which, and in doing so, the remaining basis for the petition collapses. She placed her hands flat on the table and looked at Aldrich Brent. The Duchy of Morthaven, she said, is not in question. What is in question is a pattern of land acquisition and legal manipulation carried out by Lord Brent over a period of years, with the apparent intent of gaining control of the river water system that serves 6 farming communities. I would suggest that this is the matter that warrants review. Brent looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at a room he had assessed as empty when it turns out to be full. He said nothing. His senior solicitor leaned over and spoke quietly in his ear. Brent listened. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened in the way of a man who has just recalculated something. Mr. Alderton, from his side of the table, said pleasantly, I believe Lady Voss has made the Duchy's position quite clear. We are happy to arrange a formal hearing if Lord Brent wishes to continue, at which point all documentation presented today will be submitted as evidence and the tenant statements will be entered into the record. Alternatively, Lord Brent may withdraw the petition, in which case the Duchy will consider the matter resolved. He folded his hands. We would require a decision by Monday. Brent looked at Caelian. Caelian said nothing. He did not need to. Brent left before noon. He did not say goodbye to anyone in the entrance hall. His carriage left at a pace that was just slightly too fast for dignity, which told Elara everything she needed to know about the state of his confidence. Mr. Alderton spoke with Caelian for a further 20 minutes about the legal follow-up. Mr. Holt appeared with coffee and a quiet look of satisfaction that he was too professional to make explicit. Mrs. Clare passed through the hall twice for reasons that did not quite require passing through the hall, which Elara understood as the household's version of celebration. She went to the library. She was sitting in her chair by the fire, which had burned down to a low, steady warmth, when she heard the door. She did not look up. She knew the sound of his particular approach. Caelian came to the other chair and sat. The fire was between them. The room was quiet. Outside, the October afternoon had gone grey and still, the way autumn afternoons do when the wind stops and the world seems to hold itself before the cold comes in. She looked at the fire. He said, How long have you been building that case? 6 weeks for the land documents. 3 days for the tenant statements. 1 afternoon in the village for the context that made it all make sense. He was quiet for a moment. You did it alone. I did it at home, she said. Which is mine as much as yours. That is, I believe, the arrangement. He said her name again, the way he had said it at the library table. Quiet and specific. She looked at him. He was looking at her the way she had never been looked at. Not assessed, not measured, not found sufficient or insufficient. Seen, simply and completely, the way you see a thing you have wanted to see for a long time and are finally allowed to look at without looking away. I have been waiting, he said, for a very long time. She held that. For a solution to Brent, she said, because it was easier to ask the smaller question first. For the person I would eventually be able to stop performing for, he said. The person in front of whom the chair and the walking and the whole weight of this carefully constructed life would simply be what it is, and not require either explanation or defense. The fire shifted. The afternoon was very quiet. She thought about one trunk and no one crying at the wedding and the gardener trimming the hedge on the last morning of her peace. She thought about the margin notes and the flood and the tenant with the candle in the jar who would not leave before her children. She thought about all the rooms she had been in where she was the wrong daughter, the unremarkable one, the one who was described in terms that had a gap at the center of them where the real person was. She thought about a man who had built an entire performance around survival and had chosen her, specifically, carefully, with research and intention, because she was the one person who would already understand the gap between the performance and the truth of it. "You could have told me sooner," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was afraid." "Of what?" He looked at her steadily. "That you would decide it was not worth the trouble." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the 12 years of her life in which she had decided, daily, quietly, without announcement, that her own life was worth the trouble of living it carefully. She thought about what it cost to keep deciding that. She thought about the specific kind of courage that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. "It is worth the trouble," she said. He let out a breath that was so quiet she almost did not hear it, but she did. She heard it because she had been listening to the sounds of this house for 2 months and she knew all of them now, every creak and settling and murmur, and she knew which sounds meant nothing and which sounds meant something, and this one meant everything. She looked at the fire. He looked at her. Outside, the first snow of November began to fall, very quietly, in the way of things that have been waiting for the right moment. She did not say anything else that evening. She did not need to. She was home.